Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another virtual event from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm Patrick, and Barbara's tuning in from her home office there. And it's always a delight and a privilege to welcome our friend Jacqueline Winspear back to the program. We'd love to have you back in the store, but hopefully next year. But Jackie's signed a batch of books, copies of the brand new book, A Sunlit Weapon. And she's also included cool bookmark here, which I'll hold up, just reminding you of her wonderful memoir. And those will be in each copy. So if you'd like to order a signed book, I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field on Facebook and YouTube. And I will also be monitoring this field. Should you have questions for Jackie, go ahead and put them in as they occur to you throughout the hour. And Barbara will summon me back from the darkness towards the end of the hour. I'll be happy to ask your questions. So Barbara, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Patrick. Well, Jackie, a toast to you, since this is your
cheers.
virtual book launch, my dear.
It's to you. Thank
Yay.
you. Thank you. Mine's a ginger ale, actually.
Well, mine's the real thing.
I'll be getting mine later.
So this is the 17th Macy Dobbs book, and I was moved. I want you to look at the cover, which Jackie mentions in the acknowledgments about how accurate it is. And we'll talk about this woman who is a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Transport, and her uniform. But I went to my own shelves and I retrieved my copy of Macy Dobbs, the first Macy Dobbs. And Jackie has been with us since the first Macy Dobbs for every book. And I wanted you to see, I know it's hard because of the cover, I mean the library cover, but look at the difference in the cover. I mean, I've always thought that this was an interesting one because in so much historical fiction, you don't see the face all that clearly. You know, it's often to the back and so forth. But anyway, this is the original Macy Dobbs. And the other thing that's interesting is that the size of the books, let me see if I line them up like that. I've always sort of liked the smaller size book. I think it's more cuddly and more friendly, but they've expanded. Yeah. So there we are. Jackie, tell us about the cover and why you thought it was so wonderful, why you think it's so wonderful.
Well, I love the covers anyway. I think the duo that put them together, Andrew Davidson, who's the artist and craftsman, and Archie Ferguson, the creative director, I think they do a great job. And it's wonderful because I'm involved right from the beginning, which I love. But what it is, it depicts a woman from the Air Transport Auxiliary, Britain's Air Transport Auxiliary. And they were not part of the RAF. They were a government organization set up in 1939 because they knew, you know, you've only got so many pilots to go into battle, and they were losing an awful lot. And they needed aircraft to be moved around the UK. And so they literally, women made up about 10% of the entire ATA force. It wasn't just women, it was women and men. But many of those men were veterans of the First World War, or they were commercial pilots. And in fact, the ATA was effectively founded by, trying to remember his name, Pierre Delanger, who was the actually head of British Airways at the time. British Airways later became BOAC, and then it went back to being BA and so on. But what was interesting was that, you know, they pretty soon started to get women on board, so to speak. And many of these women had been flying since their teens, the initial women that were brought on board, because they were wealthy women. They were wealthy young women, often 16, 17. And, you know, it was something to do rather than being shunted along the line to get married early to a lord or something. However, soon they had to expand the recruitment program, and they were looking for women. Funnily enough, they particularly liked women who were experienced horsewomen to train as pilots. And the reason being that if you're a horsewoman, you have to learn to be very sensitive with your hands. And therefore, you had a great deal of sensitivity when it came to piloting an aircraft. But those women initially were given all the rotten jobs. You know, they were the ones that had to take, you know, open air training aircraft in the middle of winter up to Prestwick in Scotland. And it wasn't until they got the warm Sidcot suits that they actually arrived being able to move, you know. But pretty soon they were flying all manner of aircraft. And in fact, it wasn't long after they were founded that women pilots, and we're talking young women here, you know, in their sort of 19, 20, 21, 22, started coming from overseas to volunteer. And among them was Jacqueline Cochran from the United States, who later returned to the US to set up the WASPs in doing a similar job in 1943. There was an Argentinian, there was some Czech pilots, there were definitely some Polish pilots, because, you know, the Polish definitely had it in for the Luftwaffe. But, you know, pilots from Canada, although there were also women with the Canadian Air Force who were ferry pilots as well. But yes, and one of the reasons that a lot of pilots came from other countries, women as well as men, because of course there was the Eagle Squadron in the RAF, they all wanted to get into a Spitfire. And the reason they wanted to get into a Spitfire was because it was the fastest aircraft in the world. It could go up to 400 miles an hour. And it was, everybody wanted to fly it. And, you know, you hear the women, there was on YouTube, there's those women in later years being interviewed. And, you know, they talk about the Spitfire, which everybody said was actually really a woman's kite. It was a woman's aircraft because, you know, it was kind of snug in the cockpit. And I don't know whether to tell you what one of the women said about the Spitfire. Excuse the language. She said, the Spitfire was a lady in the air, but she was a bitch on the ground. Because once you'd landed, it was really hard to maneuver. But once you were in the air, she was a lady. You could do anything with her. So that was a quote. That wasn't me saying that.
Well, we've heard worse language on this program. Some of it from me, as a matter of fact. We've never pretended not to be R-rated.
Okay, all right.
There we go.
Yeah.
I love the fact that, in fact, they were called Atta Girls, the Women Air Transport Auxiliary, because I think Atta Girl is a wonderful name. Yeah. And as Jackie points out in the book, the temptation to show off and to do some tricky flying in the Spitfires was fairly irresistible. But,
it was.
The story kicks off with a woman being, well, it turns out shot down, although nobody's clear at the beginning that she has been. And earlier there was a male pilot, very tragically crashed without any explanation. So that's part of the mystery that we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I have a couple of questions for Jackie she will not expect. And one of them is, I want you to tell us about Eccles Cakes, because Eccles Cakes figure in this story. And I was moved to go look them up because people seem to crave them and in fact, eat them with some joy. So what's an Eccles cake, Jackie?
An Eccles cake is more like a pastry, actually. And I know you've had them because you've had them at Betty's, haven't you? In Harrogate. And they're sort of saucer shaped, you know, and it's puff pastry, flaky puff pastry. And inside they've got sort of currants and raisins on, and then they've got lots of sugar on the top. And Macy has a thing about Eccles cakes. She loves Eccles cakes. So come what may, her stepmother usually tries to make some Eccles cakes for her. And I say come what may, because certain ingredients were really hard to get hold of in wartime, sugar being one of them. But so Eccles cakes turn up. I have to say, Eccles cakes are one of my late father's favorite treats. He loved an Eccles cake, and I love them. I just wish I could find gluten-free Eccles cakes now, because they're quite kind of tricky to eat. And as you know, I have to, because it was you that discovered it. I'm a gluten-free person because I have to be.
That's very true. Jackie had digestive issues, and eventually we worked out that it was celiac or gluten allergies. So to me, an Eccles cake is not so much puff pastry; it's almost a flaky. I mean, I think
it is a flaky,
kind of like a mince pie without the mincemeat, but has that wonderful fruit. And I looked them up. They are actually named for what used to be Eccles. Now has a different name. And amazingly, apparently the first one showed up in 1793. So by the time we are in 1942, when a sunlit weapon occurs, the Eccles cake was well established, and they are indeed delicious. So it made me really hungry while I was parts of the book, you wretched woman. So here we are. I'm drowning it with wine. While we are talking about a somewhat complicated wartime plot that involves Macy, her American husband, who, as we know, is affiliated with the American diplomatic service. And what we have going on here in the background is the possibility of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, making a trip to England for various reasons. She was a very dramatic figure. She was over 6 feet tall, or roughly 6 feet tall.
Yeah, she
very
is.
hard to mistake. Therefore, an easy target should she happen to be somewhere where anybody might want to take a shot at her. Whether that happens or not, you'll have to read the book to find out. But anyway, what I found to be the most riveting part of this book, and Jackie can tell you about the research that she did, is that it deals with segregation in the US Army between Black troops and white troops, segregation back home, and why the British and the Americans had differing policies about their mixed race soldiers. So Jackie, you obviously put a lot of work into figuring out what the US Army position is, because there is a young Black man who is accused of a crime. It's a habeas corpus thing. There is no body. So we're not sure what's going on with the white soldier that came from his same hometown, so to speak, and whether the Black soldier is responsible for the disappearance or possible death of this young man. But what happens to him is just horrible.
Yeah, it was there's quite a lot being written about it, but not about the instance of the Black troops that came to Britain during World War II. But none of it was very recent. There were a couple of, it was mentioned in a couple of books back in the 1970s, which of course I procured, and also read news reports and personal reflections, and you get those from things like the mass observation and so on, those different initiatives that went on during the war. So by the time America had troops coming over to the UK, Britain had been at war for 2 years, which meant her empire had been at war. So we had troops from across the empire in Britain, and a lot of troops from Canada, and South Africa. There were South African troops, there were Australians, New Zealanders, plus there were troops from other places in Africa and also the West Indies and India. Indian troops were a big thing. Now at that time, Britain had about between 7,000 and 8,000 people of color living in Britain as that were British citizens, and they were mainly in the cities. So that meant if you were in a rural area, or even a market town, a fairly large town, you'd never seen a person of color in your life. And this was long before the racial discord of the 1950s, when people from the Caribbean were initially brought in as strike breakers and then to take up employment in the UK. So there was none of this bad feeling that had came across in those years. Obviously, there were cases of, racism and so on. But as even Eisenhower noted, Britain was not so much a country that was, had this great awareness of color, but we were segregated by class, and that is the key. So American troops came to Britain in 1942, started being deployed in early 1942. The Black Americans were among the first to arrive, and that is because they weren't put into combat units at that point. They were in maintenance units. They were doing the hard job of getting everything settled. So they were building bases, they were building runways and so on. They were the blokes on the ground doing the hard work. And their arrival in Britain, and particularly, a lot of this was in rural areas, they were held with great affection and they were welcomed. And I remember reading this reflection by a woman who was a little girl and said she was so excited when the Americans rolled into town. And she said, And one of the Black Americans got out of his Jeep and came up and winked at her and held her hand. And she was just, oh, he's holding my hand. We can walk down the street together. She was so excited. They actually, and please forgive me, but I'm just repeating history here, were often referred to as darkies. And that was a term of great affection. It wasn't meant to be a slight. It was great affection. So obviously, you know, you had the American army, and on their bases, it was absolutely segregation. The white Americans didn't want to be near the Black Americans by and large. Although there was some softening around the edges at certain times. However, when they were out and about in town, the Black Americans could go where they wanted. They could go to dances and so on and so forth. They could go into the shops. No one was going to, they could go into a pub and no one was going to turn them away. You know, as one publican said, their money is as long as the color of their money is right, we don't care, you know. But it was actually apparently before the war, Churchill was asked to institute segregation in Britain, and of course he refused. There were some pretty ugly scenes that happened. There was a case, for example, in Lyons Corner House, which, as you know, was one of the famous places you get a cup of tea in London. There were many of them. In a Lyons Corner House, there was a man from the West Indies enjoying his cup of tea, and some American military police marched in and dragged him out. They dragged him out because they assumed he was an American and he shouldn't be there. And there were cases of, for example, there was one in Yorkshire that you know, some black GIs were lined up at the movie theater to go in along with everybody else, and the military police came along and tried to pull them out, and the local women with their umbrellas beat up the military police until they went. And there was a lot of that about. The locals became very protective because they didn't like this happening on their soil. No matter what came later in the 1950s, they didn't like this happening. So it was a really interesting era, a really interesting phenomenon to look into. And, you know, there was a case, there were a couple of riots, actually, and major fights in Britain between Black Americans and military police, where they just didn't want to be rounded up anymore. They knew they had a right to be there. They had a right to go into a pub, a movie theater, or whatever. And there was one case where a Black American was accused of murder, and it was the local population, who were obviously white, who literally lobbied for him not to be put to death. He was going to be sent home, and they lobbied and they did the hard work to find out that he wasn't guilty of the crime for which he was hauled in. So it was an interesting. One of the things that you know, I read about was the fact that white American soldiers could not understand why British women would dance with a Black American. They couldn't understand why this would happen. Why do they want to do that? And of course, you know, it's wartime. They're all young. They want to dance. And there was this one story that I read, this woman's reflections, and she said, you know, she got to a dance late, or a bit later than some of the other girls, and she wondered why all these white soldiers were around, but no one was asking the girls to dance. And she said to her friend, well, what's going on? Why isn't anyone dancing? You know, the girls were dancing on their own and things like. And she said, well, those American boys found out that yesterday the darkies were in here and we were all dancing with them, and they won't dance with us now. And isn't it sad? Isn't it sad? And yet, you know, as I say, you know, Britain had its own. It wasn't segregation, but we have, you know, divisions based upon class.
I've heard it said often that Americans are divided by race and Britons are divided by class. Yeah. And, you know, the distinctions are difficult to overcome in any respect. I think I told you this story, but just to prove my point, when I was living in England for several months back in the mid-'80s, at one point I went to London, and since I was a tourist, I thought then I should hit some of the highlights. And one of the things I did was walk up from my hotel at the Barclay down to the Ritz. And I thought I should have tea at the Ritz, right? That's what people do.
Yeah.
So my only question to myself was, did I really want to spend at that point 25 pounds to have tea at the Ritz? I mean,
Yeah.
it was a lot of money then. And then I thought, well,
Why
I
not?
just won't eat any other meals. I'll have tea at the Ritz and it'll be wonderful. So that was my entire discussion. So I walked in and, you know, I inquired if I could book a table using the British term, if I could book a table for tomorrow at 4. And they said, certainly, madam, we'd be delighted to have you. And that was the whole thing. So the next day I got on top of one of those red double-decker tourist bus that would go around London. I think I caught it at the American Embassy. And there was a really wonderful senior. I think he'd been in the armed services, very Cockney. And he was doing the monologue or the, you know, about all the spots that the tourist bus was observing. So towards the end, as we were driving up Piccadilly, I still remember him doing this. He looked around at all the people on the top of the bus and he said, ahead of us, he said, was the famous Ritz Hotel. He said, now really posh people go there for tea, but of course, none of the likes of you or me would be welcome. And I had this moment in which I thought, you know, I could say something. And then I thought, no, there's no point in it. And besides, I also realized, and
You're an
even
American.
if he could go, he wouldn't go because he would be frozen out by that really incredible British politeness that is actually more wounding than if they just yell at you.
Yeah.
he would, I mean, I could have asked him to go as my guest. And I thought, you know, no, that would be really unkind.
Yeah.
But that illustrated for me what you're talking about, that, you know, it never occurred to me to wonder if I were good enough to go. It was only a question of money. And it never occurred to him that if he could afford 25 pounds, then he'd be welcome.
And of course, you know, you are an American and different reception. There was actually, this point was made in a very interesting way in Fiona Hill's recent book, There's Nothing for You Here. And she has made this point about class in Britain. And of course, we know that Maisie is very sensitive to this issue and has managed to break down barriers, which could be broken down. But anyway, Fiona Hill recounts something that happened not to her, but to someone else in, I think it was in the 80s at some point. And some of the people watching might remember this band called Fine Young Cannibals, and the lead singer, Roland Gift, who was, you know, from I think his father was from the Caribbean. So he was a person of color. And he was living in the north of England, you know, his mates were all Irish. And no one thought anything about it. You know, I'm me, they're Irish, and we all mixed together anyway. And there were others, you know, from the Caribbean there. And they were out and about one day and wandered into this area that was definitely, you know, a posher area. And there was this black gentleman came along with his 2 little girls and quickly hurried them away. And Roland Gift said in that moment he realized color wasn't the issue. It was just that they were poor kids from a poor area, therefore they weren't good enough. And that was a really interesting insight, the way Fiona Hill described that and sort of described that scenario. And it's absolutely true, you know. Certainly, in my experience.
Well, for those of you who don't know the term posh, which is what Britain, we call it upscale or something similar here in the United States. What it actually comes from are the words port out, starboard home, which wealthier people could afford on ships' passages if they were sailing from Britain to India. And so you clearly wanted to be away from the sun. And so port out, meaning you would be on the east side of the ship, and starboard home would be the same thing. And from that, because wealthy people generally were able to book that passage, came the term posh. But I brought this up because if you're watching Bridgerton, for example, you would think that Britain was incredibly multiracial in the 18th century. Or if you watch today, if you watch crime shows like Vera, for example, or Line of Duty, you would see, it's all mixed race, mixed marriages, it doesn't appear that any of the American preoccupation with race permeates British society now or even then. But what happens in a Sunlit Weapon is that the US Army rules trump the, I really hate using that verb now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too.
It's
Me
ruined
too.
it for me. Anyway, they do trump whatever British rules there are, and Macy has trouble understanding that and really resists it. And part of her struggle throughout this book is to protect this young Black man who was found bound and seriously ill, captive in a rundown barn by one of the women Air Force, one of the Atta girls, and accused of probably killing his mate, the white guy from the same town back home. And I like that is part of her mission.
Mhm.
Meantime, she's also dealing with bullying at school. That's another thing that we hear about, all the way from Jane Eyre forward, Jackie, is the possibility of schools in Britain, desperate things happening to young children who are bullied. Is that something else that you wanted to bring into this book?
Well, I mean, children can be bullied anywhere. The children are bullied in today. That the level of bullying online, particularly impacting young women, is just horrible. So bullying doesn't only happen in British schools, it happens in any schools, anywhere in the world. There's always the one kid who's a bit different. And a theme throughout this book is prejudice. And there's prejudice against women who fly, women who have a certain power. There's prejudice against people of color. There's prejudice really leveled against, which reflect on the time, of course. The child in question has olive skin because her father was Maltese. Now, this is a time when, after Italy came into the war, on behalf of Germany, I mean, you didn't want to be Italian. And people changed their names, but for a while Italian restaurants were vandalized and so on and so forth, and this thing happens. We've seen it happen all the time in this country, mosques being attacked and so on and so forth, and now, of course, this latest horror is causing even more problems in that regard. So prejudice is a theme, and I think with so many people converging on a country at the same time, then you're going to see that. There's also prejudice again in terms of gender and also income. I mean, there's the young women who work on the land, and initially it was thought, oh, those girls can't do this work, not only are they from the town, but they're women. But by golly, the land army absolutely proved themselves. And that's one of the things, of course, that Eleanor Roosevelt that is the key reason why Eleanor Roosevelt came to Britain in 1942. She was invited by the Queen and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, later to be known as the Queen Mother. She was invited by the Queen to come to view the war work that the women of Britain were doing. That was her focus. So she not only saw the women of the ATA, the Atta girls, but there was the WAFs, there were the Wrens, there were the women who worked in munitions factories. I mean, she literally pounded the earth visiting, and she could not, literally, she wore holes in the soles of her shoes because she was only allowed to bring one pair of shoes. The flight went via Shannon, and she had the same baggage allowance as everybody else, which didn't amount to much. So she basically, I think, only had one pair of shoes with her. And they had to find her another pair of shoes because she wore her soles through, and she was stuffing newspaper in them. And, you know, and that's why you see all the footage at the time. She's wearing the same coat and the same hat. She had the same dress for evenings, and she was there for, you know, a long time. It must have been really uncomfortable for her. And, you know, some of the things that she experienced, and I know I've segued straight into Eleanor Roosevelt. She made a point of visiting the Black American troops in Britain. And by the way, just this week, the 6888 Battalion, which was the only battalion of Black American women in the US Army to be posted overseas during the war. They were posted to Britain. They finally received the Congressional Medal of Honor, I think it is, this week, for their service at last, you know. But Eleanor Roosevelt, she wanted to see, she wanted to visit American troops, and she made a point of visiting Black American troops. And it was really interesting. Apparently her son was in Britain serving with the US Army, and she was going to visit him, and she had a driver, not loads of security, just one driver, police driver, taking her to visit her son. She had a code name while she was in Britain, and the code name was Rover, which of course was also a popular dog's name then, but a rover means someone who is like to just rove off, which of course she was. She would just go off, you know, off the plan. But because there were a lack of road signs in Britain, they got lost. And he luckily had a radio, and apparently he radioed back to his base saying, "Rover has lost her pup, send help," which I thought was very funny, a very funny story. But yes, it was so you know, Eleanor Roosevelt, she really just didn't stop all the time she was in Britain, did not stop. And interestingly enough, yes, indeed, there was great concern for her security, because you know, she would have been a key target for Nazi Germany to take out, and there were German agents after her. Interestingly enough, the day after she visited Canterbury Cathedral and also the village of Barham in Kent, Canterbury Cathedral was bombed, and because they were a day late. They got literally the Nazis they thought she was going to be there that day, and she had already left. But had they got their day right, you know, who knows what might have happened.
Oh, that's very true. Although, you know, recently I read a very interesting book, can't remember what it's called at the moment, but well reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, that pointed out, which something I had somehow or other, Jackie, I can't believe that I never figured this out. I always assumed that America declared war against Nazi Germany at the same time it declared war against Japan. In other words, that Pearl Harbor precipitated us into both fronts of World War II. But it actually turns out that Hitler declared war against the United States a week after Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
And you know, this particular book pointed out that that was one of his two disastrous mistakes.
Yes.
One of which, of course, was invading Russia.
Yeah.
And the other was declaring war against the United States, because up until then there was some question about whether the United States would fight the war on two fronts. And so by 1942, of course, this was a moot point, because we were already in the war. But you can't imagine that if Hitler hadn't done that, that assassinating Eleanor Roosevelt while visiting England would certainly have brought about a U.S. declaration of war if it hadn't happened already. So we've talked about the hard stuff, but one of the other, let's talk about the not hard stuff, because this is in part a love story. This is in part about Macy and her husband, her American husband, and their marriage, and learning how to live together. Macy's past, her first love, Simon, and then her husband, the Viscount, who was killed in Canada, and her unborn baby that died. We reviewed that history, and that part is wonderful. It's a love story between Macy and Simon and their adopted daughter, Anna, the little girl who is bullied at school for her dark skin because she might be Italian. when it turns out she's Maltese. And then there's the possibility of one of Patricia's sons falling in love with an American. And there's the grief that one of the women pilots feels for her fiance, who was the first to die in what turns out to be the plot going on here. And it's also about family. And Macy spends time talking to Maurice Blanche, who of course been dead for a long time, but his techniques have stayed with her. And there are various points in this book where she centers herself by thinking about Maurice and what he would have encouraged her to do, the techniques that he taught her. Because a lot of this is about Macy being a psychologist more than it is an investigator. So you had a wonderful time kind of reviewing all this history of Macy and where you've landed her after years of grief.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before, but one of the things I wanted to do when I realized I possibly had a series, which I wasn't quite sure about when I wrote Maisie Dobbs, was to think about what I really wanted to create. And I realized what I wanted to do was to take this, actually not just Maisie, but this sort of ensemble cast, if you will, through a period of time, the most tumultuous time in the 20th century, when there was so much change on every level, society, technology, wars, obviously, and to follow their experiences, to see who they are, not only as a result of the case they're working on, but who are they as they are impacted by the events of their day. And we all know the events of our day impact us. We only know from going down and filling our car with gas right now how the big events affect us personally. But it's like Billy. Billy and his family, they're the kind of people, and I know we've all met them. You think, goodness me, what else is going to happen to it was one thing after another, and yet still people carry on. So I wanted to if you will, create a series that was also a saga that also had family at the heart, and the family I'm talking about is the family that we make that's maybe beyond those that we're directly related to, the people who are in our orbit. And Maisie has, for a long time was the very isolated character, and that was of her making, and then began to bloom in different ways. And she doesn't want to lose that. And she has surprised, and in this book she surprises herself the levels to the point to which she will go to protect her daughter, and I think that surprises her, but it shouldn't surprise her, because that's what mothers do. And so yes, there's different people. There's Priscilla and her family, and we learn more about what's happening with her boys, and of course one of them does bring something pretty big on the whole family group towards the end. And then there's Billy and his family, and of course even his daughter is a victim of this bullying, and that's because of her London accent. She's living in the country and she's got a London accent. So there's that kind of prejudice again as well. I would say that the prejudice against people from the cities coming into rural areas was way worse than anything that people of color at that time would have experienced. Well,
sort of an echo of the class distinction. I mean, regional speech or dialect. I mean, a posh BBC accent is it's a lot less of that today, where the internet has softened up, I think, a lot of the regional speech habits and persuaded people to sound more alike. And yet we were watching a new Irish show on Acorn, which I think is based on a book by Brian McGilvery called Bloodlands, but I might be wrong, but I think it is. But in any case, that speech pattern has a lot to do with what goes on in there. And at one point, in order to communicate between two of the policemen, they revert to Irish so that nobody can listen to them. But there was a time in which people weren't allowed to speak Welsh or weren't allowed to speak Irish.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just as in this country, we tried to eradicate Native American languages and force children to go to Indian schools and learn English and so forth. And now all of that's kind of reversing. But you can really hear the difference between an Australian accent, a New Zealand accent,
Yes.
British accent, Scottish accent, Welsh accent, and an Irish accent. I mean, particularly if you watch a lot of international television, where I'm happy to say many crime stories wind up. And then you had a different experience with characters and so forth that you have come to love. Remind me, Jackie, to ask you about television possibilities for Macy when we get to that. But anyway, you know, at the time that you're writing about, those regional, urban, rural, or shire by shire, county by county accents were a really big thing. Just as in America, a Southern accent versus a Maine accent versus a Texas accent or a Midwestern accent, those were pretty big things then too, weren't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, in Britain, you know, there's the accent, then there's dialect, you know, and that throws something else in there. I can remember when my husband was watching, what was it? Last Tango in Halifax, and he said to me, "So what's the difference between nout and out?" And I couldn't wait to tell my friend Corinne about that, because she comes from Yorkshire. And I said, "Okay, so John wants to know what the difference is between nout and out." I said, "He keeps saying nout and out." I said, "I know what it is, but I want you to tell me." And we just laughed about it. You know, it's nothing or anything, but broadly speaking. But that's I don't know if you've ever heard. Oh, what's his name? There's an actor from up north, the one who played the not the skipper in Star Trek, the bald-headed skipper. I can't remember his name. Patrick. He does a wonderful piece just purely in North Yorkshire dialect, and it's you know, you couldn't understand a word of it unless you were from up there.
One, right?
Yes, yeah, Patrick somebody or other.
I can't think of his last name, but here's Patrick. Patrick Stewart.
Thank you,
Patrick Stewart. Isn't it wonderful how he comes out of the black ether with answers to things whenever we falter? It's so helpful. Indeed, so. And it isn't, you've mentioned some of them, but Macy's relationship with her father and her stepmother, with her former in-laws, are also a part of this. And I really like the way that she and her husband are trying to work out how to navigate their marriage. Different countries, often different loyalties. They can't really talk because of the Official Secrets Acts. How is it that they are going to navigate the war years, because it's only 1942? And if they both survive, how are they going to navigate the post-war years? You know, where will they live? What will they do? Macy has some serious responsibilities and inheritance. So, you know, if you have a wartime marriage between people in different countries, you do eventually, when the war is over, have to sort out how your life is going to go from there.
Certainly happened to.
In fact, as a British immigrant, Jackie lives in California and has lived there for a long time, but she is an immigrant. And her husband, if I remember right from the acknowledgement in this, didn't her husband's family have somebody that went to fight in England?
Well, my mother-in-law was with the American Army Nursing Corps.
Right.
She actually had I mean, I guess you could have called it quite a jammy posting. She was originally, as far as the story goes, was with the Navy as a nurse before the war, and she was, you know, a young woman based in Florida, very nicely based in Florida on the beach, and but when after Pearl Harbor, she wanted to serve overseas. She wanted to serve her country in a different posting, and she realized that she wasn't going to be posted overseas in her current position. So she sort of marched around and joined the army instead. and she was shipped out in early 1942. She shipped out on the Queen Mary, which of course, you know, was in battle livery then.
Right.
And she was based in England until she didn't go home till 1946. And she told some lovely stories, actually. I mean, she was about to be redeployed to the Pacific Theatre when VJ Day happened. And so eventually she went back home to the United States. But she had some interesting stories. And in fact, there's one that she was actually the youngest of a family of 8. And she told me that for some reason she had this bee in her bonnet that she had to look after her father. And she basically arranged for most of her salary to be sent to him during the war, because she thought, what's going to happen to my dad? And I think she was only 22 or 23, something like that. Well, she got home after the war, and her father basically said, well, I don't know why you were sending this to me, but it's all in a bank account for you. And she said she was a real fashion plate. She loved clothes right up to her dying day. She died when she was 90 something. And she said, Jackie, I had been in uniform for all those years. I had not had any clothing that was nice. She said it took me about 3 days to blow them off. And she said she went out shopping every single day buying new clothes as soon as she got home with her money that was in the account.
I love that. Well, post-war, everybody had to figure out, you know, what to do.
Yeah.
One of my favorite World War II books is by Joseph Cannon called Istanbul Passage, in
Oh.
which when the war ends, a whole lot of people are caught in Istanbul, and the jobs that they have been filling during the war have just come to an end. And then the question arises, what are they going to do with their lives now, which have been disrupted? What about their relationships? Where are they going to live? You know, what are they going to do? I mean, when the war was over, there were some really serious problems that people who lived through it had to face, which we're not getting to yet with Macy. So what we have here is we have some kind of sabotage thing going on. We have some kind of a potential threat to Eleanor Roosevelt going on. We have a young Black man being held by the US Army for a murder he may or may not have committed, because, as I said before, habeas corpus, there is nobody. Then we have the whole family dynamic, Billy's family, Macy's family, you know, there's a lot going on in this book. But I want to end this before we bring Patrick out. I want to remind everybody that one of the reasons that we read Jackie is because she is such a superb writer. And because this book mostly takes place in the country, she has an opportunity to describe the countryside. And I'm on page 122 because I have one of those annoying memories that remembers every page, you know, what's on it. But I'm just going to read a little bit from this because it's so beautiful. The stile at the edge of the wood was old and lichen covered, so Maisie watched her step as she climbed over and set off along an ancient footpath that would take her down to the river. Even before she heard the rushing water, she knew it was close. It might be autumn, but wild garlic underfoot had retained its pungent aroma, though it was without the company of the delicate yellow celandines that, come spring, would open their egg yellow faces to the promise of warmer days ahead. That's really lovely. I love the egg yellow faces, Jackie, but you know, I know how much from your beautiful memoir, how much you love the countryside and, you know, your parents' relationship with it, your own childhood in it. And I don't want to call it nature writing because it isn't, but this book has some absolutely gorgeous passages about the countryside. And the crime is solved in part because Macy understands the countryside and figures out what may have happened in a way that a city investigator or US Army investigator would never think of. So should we call Patrick up?
Thank you. Thank you for that, Barbara. Thank you.
Well, I was greatly moved by it, Jackie, and I've always thought that your writing was just superb. Patrick, come join us and see if there are questions you have or questions from the audience.
Sure. Let's see. What do we have?
Or you can make it up as you go along.
Yes. There's some nice comments. Diana says, during the war, young Princess Elizabeth learned how to fix military trucks.
She was a member of the Mechanized Transport Corps. So she didn't just, she did her national service in the war. And that's, she learned to drive, she learned to be she was a full mechanic, you know. Yeah, it was the Mechanized Transport Corps.
And Prince Philip served in the war, if I recall.
Oh yes,
correctly.
yes,
I mean,
he was in the
officer.
Royal Navy. Yeah, and saw some serious action. Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, it's miraculous that they both survived. You know, to carry on for their very long lives.
Yeah, especially as Buckingham Palace was in fact bombed, because originally the Parliament, the Prime Minister and so on, wanted the young princesses to be sent to Canada for their safety, and the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, famously said, "I will not leave the King." Was it? She said, "The children will not leave me. I will not leave the King, and the King will not leave England, or will not leave Great Britain." Sorry, I made a mistake. They will not leave Great Britain, and which it totally endeared her to the whole country. And she always said that she was glad when Buckingham Palace was hit by a bomb, because she felt, now I can look the East End in the face. Because
it's also important to remember that she was a Scot. I mean, she was born in Scotland.
Glamis, Elizabeth of Glamis, yeah.
That's right. So indeed, she would have said Great Britain, not just England, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, she was very. Her brother was killed in the early part of the First World War. Actually, I think, I can't remember which battle it was exactly. It'll come to me as soon as we're offline. But yeah, in the early part of the First World War, I think in 1914. Yeah.
I do have questions. People are very curious about movie and TV news.
I don't really have any movie and TV news, except to say that the books are currently optioned, and you know, it takes an awfully long time to go from that point of being optioned to the point of being sold to what point of production. It's a very long process. So I don't have any news at the moment, except to say, yes, the series, the books are under option, and we wait with bated breath. I will let you know as soon as I know.
Historical series are more expensive to film than contemporary ones.
Well, not only are they very expensive to film, I mean, they cost a fortune per hour of programming. But actually, it's really interesting that as much as they are incredibly popular right now, there is always a sense of, but from the production companies, oh, we don't want to do historicals. No, we don't want to do historicals. And then, of course, a historical comes along that just blows the marketplace, and they still don't want to do historicals. So it's interesting how there are these phases, and that, you know, suddenly, for example, would this come as any surprise that in 2016 the TV, and when I say the production companies, not so much the production companies, but the broadcasters all wanted dark dystopian fare. Oh, I wonder why. And you know, then there was the wanting, and this, to your point earlier, wanting regional fare, particularly with regard to the United Kingdom. But so they wanted, you know, it had to be set in the north, or it had to be set in Wales, or it had to be anywhere but London. You know, and so there's always this, and of course, you know, as time has gone on, then you know, there are different requirements from the broadcasters, which is why you're seeing situations like, you know, Bridgerton, which, you know, is fantasy, but it's
fantasy and great clothes, Jackie. I have
great
to say
clothes,
that a reason to watch
clothes.
Bridgerton is truly for the costumes. I mean, they are absolutely.
What was
fabulous.
I was watching the other day? Oh, I was watching The Gilded Age, and whatever people say about The Gilded Age, you've got to love the frocks. You know, the colors and everything.
I'm sure, but I went off Julian Fellows when I thought he really did a poor job writing subsequent. I thought the first two seasons of Downton Abbey were great, And then I thought it just went off.
Oh,
the
after
rails.
that, it was abysmal. I
Oh.
mean, it was abysmal. Well, I shouldn't
really
say that.
was.
This is really bad. But you know, it's not fact. It's not fact. It's a story, and it's just like The Crown. When you know, I liked the first one, and then they started doing stuff that would never have happened, and I thought, well, you know, no, I've gone off that. But
I
still,
don't like to watch anything about people still alive.
Yeah.
I'm really not a fan of The Crown or whatever, because
No.
I think it's a tremendous intrusion.
it's incredibly
problem is
disrespectful.
that people are so uncritical that they could actually think it's all true,
Yeah,
when in fact it's a story. So I'm opposed to it on many levels.
yeah.
Anyway, they're
Be
very
that as it may.
and Perry's Pitt series is under option, and you know it's Victorian. There are a number of wonderful series, historical series, that have been optioned but haven't yet come to fruition.
Yeah.
And part of it is just the cost. Part of it's the
It's
chemistry, too.
it's what is it? Something like, I mean, the Crown apparently hit the figure out of the park. That was what at the time the first series was to date the most expensive TV series, and I think and it's only escalated since then. But it for per hour of programming that you saw on TV, it cost over $10 million per hour of programming. And that's, and funnily enough, people always think it's the costumes that cost a lot and things like that. But it's not. It's everything else. And in fact, I can remember my husband telling me this story. He used when he studied film and TV at university, and film and communicate, whatever the subject was. But his earlier jobs were in TV, and he worked in film and so on. He was he did all sorts of things, obviously the behind the camera stuff. But when he was just a young, straight out of college guy, they were filming in San Francisco, and it was the director or whatever put a big massive wad of notes in his hand and said, I want you to go up that street, and I don't care what you have to do. I just want every car off this street in the next half an hour. Because people were parking, you know what San Francisco is like, you just park anywhere. And he literally was knocking on a door, and he'd say, which car's yours on this street? Well, it's that Ford over there. Well, would you move it? Well, what's going to make me move it? Tell me how much you want to, $300? There you go. Next door. How much do you want to move your car? I think it's the VW there. Oh, well, I'll do it for a couple of $100. Right, move your car. And he said, literally, that's what he did. That was his first job. Now, that's a tiny thing. And he had several $1,000s in his hand just to get the cars off the street. But, there's the whole pulling it together. There's the whole pulling it together. It costs a fortune.
Well,
Yeah.
Macy Dobbs occupies quite a long time arc, and it doesn't always stay in England. I mean, we have Gibraltar. I actually once toured Gibraltar a few years ago, largely based on what Jackie's book about Macy and Gibraltar was up to. And I think she's in India and briefly in Canada. So you have that issue also. The very best World War II television series, I think,
Foyle's War.
Foyle's War by Anthony Horowitz is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And in fact, going back to this whole bit about the prejudice against Italians and foreign nationals, there's a really dramatic moment in Foyle's War where a Italian restaurant in Hastings, which had been a much loved local spot, is in fact blown up. So, what you say about all that has been depicted in other ways and is truly terrible. Yeah. I'm sorry, Patrick, we really digressed. Go back to questions.
That's okay. There is a question from Diana who would like to know, will Eleanor Roosevelt be in the book or off camera like JFK's father?
She knows that there is a conversation. There is a very brief conversation between Macy and Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Yeah, so she's on camera and off camera, so to speak.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Carol would like to know, she says, are you working on the next book, and would you consider stories about a young Maisie and Maurice?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm currently working on a novel that has nothing to do with Maisie Dobbs. It's what they call in the trade, as we know, a standalone. And you know, when I first wrote a series, I had no idea. Someone said a standalone novel. I thought, what on earth's that? Yeah, it's a novel set in 1947, post-war Britain, and it involves the Secret Service and organized crime, and plus dastardly acts in the higher levels of government, which kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? Really? But there you go. That's it's a novel, something completely different, and a younger Maisie. I've actually not only thought about that, I haven't written anything, but I have planned out an earlier Maisie, because I always thought I'd like to write about her apprenticeship when she was a much different person, you know. And that's been one of the I think for me, one of the joys of writing the series thus far is that, you know, I'm following, as I said earlier, I'm following people as they grow and change, and that is as I've always said, nice work if you can get it. You know, it challenges you as a writer, but also as a person, to understand how people grow and change. And so it would be a bit of a jump to go back to that girl who didn't have the confidence that Maisie Dobbs has now, although Maisie has never forgotten that lack of confidence. And, you know, just like all these little tweaks, your character.
Yes, but it would also be nice, Jackie, to spend more time with Morris, because even though he's been dead for so long in the series, he's still there. And particularly in this book, he's a real presence, even though it's not like, you know, he's appearing in some ghost fashion or anything.
No, as people do, you know, when we reflect upon them, we reflect upon conversations, and Maisie can go back to his letters and his notes and so on. Morris was a very powerful character to deal with, actually. Morris would, dare I say, I'd wake up at night, you know, in the middle of the night thinking, just leave me alone, would you? I'm right about you tomorrow. Leave me alone. Let me sleep. You know, it's a little dab of do me sometimes of Morris. I had to get rid of him. No, seriously, he was a very powerful character to work with.
Well, I hope that you might think about seriously writing about Morris. Morris wouldn't be young, although, you know, because he was more mature when he met Macy, but it really would be interesting to spend some time with him. Anything else, Patrick?
Let's see. Someone suggests a prequel to Maisie Dobbs, or a series for girls, a young adult. That would be interesting.
It's interesting that a lot of young adults already read the series, and the reason they read the series, if they don't discover it themselves, is that it is used in schools. And you know, I'm always getting the sorts of emails, and I just bought the first 3 books for my granddaughter because she's turned 12 now or something, you know. But there, you know, there are some difficult scenes which are not always appropriate for younger people. And it's interesting how many, you know, someone said that to me the other day when I did an event last week on behalf of the Charter for Compassion, and they said, we've got an awful lot of men signed up for this. And I said, I have an awful lot of male readers, you know, and a good number. And it's interesting how many have bought the books for their wives and daughters.
Well, I don't think of your work as women's fiction by any means.
No,
I always
it's not.
thought of it as gender neutral. So I think that makes perfectly good sense. Anything else, Pete?
Let's see. Well, somebody brings up on YouTube, Julie brings up Neville Shute. And she says Neville Shute wrote a book called The Checkerboard about 4 soldiers in England in World War II. One of them is a Black American accused wrongly of a crime. She says it's an enjoyable book.
Oh, Neville Shute was I don't know that one, but there definitely was a case in Britain of as I explained earlier, of a Black American accused of a crime, and it was literally the rearguard action from the British people that stopped him being
Neville Shute was on the beach, right? And
That's right, on the beach.
on the
Yeah.
beach in a town called Alice.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I remember those two.
Sarah would like to, you've talked a little bit about this already, but she has a question about your research for this particular book, and what were your favorite kind of sources that you came across?
Oh, I think I read, I had about 4 different books on Eleanor Roosevelt. I read her newspaper column. I've got a book of her newspaper columns. And of course, I love going after old footage of people, so you can watch their movement and everything, and also other perspectives. I mean, they thought that they would fly. She flew into. She left the United States under an assumed name, and she was with her secretary, and they both under assumed names, and in fact they said, well, does anyone know she's actually in Ireland? They said, well, everybody knows. They knew as soon as she got off the plane. She's 6 foot tall, for goodness sake. And it was so funny reading that. There was a book published in the 1970s by Norman Longmate called The GIs, and it was essentially about the GIs in Britain. That was a pretty good book to read. And they also, I read the ones particularly that had sections on Black American soldiers, and also, Eleanor Roosevelt was very keen for the Black American soldiers to move beyond maintenance units. She'd actually taken a flight with a Black aviator, and she thought he was brilliant, and so she wanted more in the Air Force, and more in in combat units, which eventually happened, and she really lobbied for that. So reading a lot around that, but also, there's is really getting into a sense of place. I mean, you really had to. I mean, we're all thinking about this a bit at the moment, but you couldn't just leap in your car. And a lot of people just mothballed their cars throughout the war because petrol was so hard to get hold of, and it was you had petrol coupons. You had to have special reasons to travel, which of course I have to find special. Macy doesn't always get to leap into her car, and one of the challenges is, of course, well, she's fortunate in that the Compton's chauffeur has a little stash of gasoline ready to give to her, and so there were things like that, and what's on ration. And Eleanor Roosevelt, when she came to Britain, she was immediately given a ration book, and she would have had it no other way, because she didn't want to experience anything that, or any have food that the average Brit was not was not getting. Although there was one woman who was from the Wrens, which of course is the Women's Royal Naval Service, who said that it was great to be invited to a luncheon with Mrs. Roosevelt. She said, because I had really good food. She hadn't had a decent meal for a long time. As an aside, I thought one of the funniest things I read about Eleanor Roosevelt was, I mean, literally in the room she was given at Buckingham Palace, it was freezing cold. I mean, that is a freezing cold place anyway, even with central heating. And she had a 1-bar electric heater, 1 bar, which could only be on for so many minutes a day. There was cardboard up at the windows because the windows had been blown out in the explosion. Plus, of course, you had to have your blackout curtains. But there was a big black line in the base of the bath because you could not have any more than 5 inches of hot water in your bath. And that was it. It doesn't matter whether she's Mrs. Roosevelt, whether she's the Queen, or who she is. 5 inches is the maximum you can have in your bath. But of course, she was lucky to have a place with a bathroom, because in Britain during the war, only 47% of British households, of households in England, had indoor facilities. It was 49% in Scotland. So England and Wales had less than Scotland. I don't know why that was, but
There's a wonderful book by Robert Harris about Bletchley Park, but one of the things he points out was how dirty everybody was and how gray everything was, because there was no real dry cleaning. Soap was at a premium. There was no real hot water. and, people's levels of personal hygiene and sanitation plummeted. Many people who were born or young people during World War II ended up with bad teeth because there wasn't enough calcium in their diets, enough milk, and dental care was hard to come by. There's a lot that you don't think about in a war situation besides being blown up. There's all kinds of deprivation. So Patrick, is there anything else, or should we thank Jackie for her wonderful attendance and patience?
Yeah, I think that's about it.
All right.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for my ramblings, putting up with my ramblings.
But everything we do is about digressions, Jackie.
Yeah,
that.
no, we
We've
always
done this
have done.
together for,
I know.
19 books or 20 books, actually.
Something like that, yeah.
It has been.
Yeah.
So we do have autographed copies of A Sunlit Weapon. And don't let our discussion convince you that this is an agenda book, because it really isn't. There's wonderful stories involved and wonderful family and country scenes and so forth. So it's always a great pleasure to read one of Jackie's books. And I really look forward to your standalone. So maybe by then you'll come see us. Anyway, thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.